So we're back at the Cracks in Postmodernity. We have David Dudrick today, who is a professor of philosophy at Colgate. He's written some very interesting stuff about Foucault, about Nietzsche, and some other topics that we'll get into. But David, first of all, thank you for coming on.
Oh, thank you, Stephen. It's a real pleasure.
Yes, so no, I'm very much looking forward to discussing some of the stuff you've written recently. But before we get into that, just give listeners a little bit of a sense of your background and the kind of topics you focus on in your work.
Sure. Let's see, I'm a product of northeastern Pennsylvania, and I'm from Nanticoke, actually, which is near the Wilkes-Barre Scranton area, a place where we grew up and aspired to get to Scranton, but then the office came out, and we realized maybe that wasn't the right way to set our sights. So when I went to college and told my parents that I was interested in studying philosophy, they were sort of aghast, not being academically inclined. My mother, said, "Oh, David, why wouldn't you major in English? At least then you could write greeting cards," she said.
Yeah.
Um, because she thought, you go to college, you become a doctor or a lawyer or something like that. And instead, I ended up pursuing philosophy, and I grew up in sort of an observant Catholic household, and while I had the kinds of struggles that anybody has as a college student. I never, abandoned my faith. I might have sort of shifted to evangelicalism for a while, but certainly not abandoned my faith. And yet I did find myself particularly attracted to Nietzsche. It's funny, my college professor, who was my mentor, told me that he basically forbade me to read Nietzsche or to take a course on Nietzsche until my senior year because he thought it was a corrupting influence. But that only made me want to read it all the more. And so I did find that while Nietzsche was, of course, an ardent and virulent critic of Christianity and of the faith I held dear, he took it very seriously. Um, and so that was very attractive to me. He showed me the importance of faith in various ways. And so going to graduate school at Notre Dame, I found myself trained in analytic philosophy, which was, I think, very helpful. And but still attracted to continental figures like Nietzsche and Foucault and some of the Anglo-continental philosophers, you might say, like Rorty and Charles Taylor and Bernard Williams, people like that. And so I did pursue a PhD in philosophy there at Notre Dame with an emphasis on continental philosophy read in such a way as I would hope that analytic philosophers would be able to appreciate their work, and found myself at Colgate University about, oh gosh, almost 25 years ago now, and have been here since, working on issues surrounding Nietzsche, maybe primarily, but also certainly Foucault, in whom I'm increasingly and very interested and have been for a very long time, and also interested in issues having to do with philosophy and faith.
Yeah, so I mean, I do want to get to Nietzsche in a moment, but first, let's start with, I mean, how I found you, the compact essay on Foucault. And, I was
Yeah,
telling you, like, I went to a Catholic university, but was, I mean, not super committed to like, the tradition, the Catholic tradition, doctrine, etc., and was very up with like the popular kind of theories of the day. So reading Foucault and Butler and Sartre and all them.
yeah,
But like I was given the very pop standard version, like not but like the one that like was used to kind of endorse certain yeah, like certain fad ideologies of
sure.
the day. And it on one hand, I was like, okay, as someone of faith, like I struggle to really embrace what they're saying, and at least the way that it was being framed, because like, yeah, it's kind of problematic in plenty of ways. But then the reaction, like the conservative reaction against the post-structuralist, postmodernists, to me, it was also kind of empty. It's like, okay, I mean, these people aren't the Antichrist. They're not destroying everything. But when I started to find people who had more nuanced takes, like plenty of people who write for Compact, people who are contributing to the Cracks in Postmodernity Substack, like who understand, okay, like post-structuralism is much more nuanced, much more multifaceted than the pop version, than the ones used to to fuel the kind of like the gender and sexual identity ideology that we're seeing. And it's
Yeah.
actually much more interesting when you really engage those nuances. And I think for me, one of the things that stood out from your piece is that, like, again, people like Foucault are used to create this new kind of dogmatism when it comes to sexual morality and sexual identity. And there's nothing dogmatic about post-structural thought, especially for Foucault. It's more a kind of playfulness and creativity, a fluidity, rather than like, this is my identity, that's what it is, you have to accept it or else. So yeah, I'm just like, I'm curious, like, how did you come into Foucault? Like, again, granted that my orientation in was like that kind of very rigid one. Like, how did you learn about him? And like, did it take you a while to really grasp what he was trying to say, I guess?
Yeah, I certainly agree with what you say about the conservative reaction to people like Foucault, and especially to Foucault himself, because I think that while many of Foucault's followers might deserve a kind of reaction, I don't think Foucault himself does. I think that he's a very serious and nuanced thinker. And I was introduced to him in graduate school by my advisor, Gary Gutting, who had written pretty extensively on Foucault and who was a philosopher of science, sort of in the analytic tradition. And so I came to Foucault. Um, Gutting used to sort of joke that he was making Foucault readable for, making Foucault boring.
Mhm.
And I don't know if it was quite true to say that he was making Foucault boring, but he was taking him very seriously.
Yeah.
And I found that the work that he did, sorry, I guess reading Discipline and Punish and then History of Sexuality as I did initially, I was very struck by the way in which they were not obviously ideological or neatly categorizable in terms of today's ideologies.
Yeah.
I expected that they would be perfectly in line with liberal ideology or progressive ideology and sort of railing against conservative ideology. And it's certainly not that. It's more, as you say, in many ways more fluid than that. In fact, it seems like this idea, the very idea of identity, was one that Foucault personally bristled against, and I think that he thought generally that categories of identity can be a trap and can be a way of exerting power and having power exerted over one. Um, so I think I was especially struck reading the history of sexuality in thinking that he really is not sort of it's almost as though he's doing the opposite of what certain kinds of progressive activists are doing, talking about embracing one's identity. It seems like he's skeptical of precisely that, which I found to be quite striking. I also found that in many ways that Discipline and Punish did not fit the standard
Mhm.
way that I thought it was going to go. I think that there are resonances with some things C.S. Lewis has written in that book. I think,
Yeah.
which is seems strange, but I think it's so. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but that's the thing to me that's so strange about how I was taught Foucault and like how he's used,
Mm,
in most cases today. That again, like, first of all, he's trying to offer this kind of broad view of development of certain sexual categories. And you see that, I mean, if you read History of Sexuality, there really isn't a case for this, orientation essentialism, this idea that you are born this way and it's fixed and there's nothing you can do about it. Like, because he's showing how, okay, it used to be that the sodomite was like it implied a particular action. It was not a state of being, a state of soul.
Right.
Um, Now it's this idea that like if you have certain desires, then that's a sign that that's who you are. Don't deny it anymore. And now you have to publicize. Whereas like, yeah, I mean, sure, in the past anyone could have had certain desires, but like the question is, what are you doing? Um, so like if you really take what he's saying seriously, you understand that the category of sexual orientation is kind of suspect. It's a kind of flimsy one. Um, but also again, like this, I mean, maybe he doesn't argue for it explicitly in the book, but like you can see that he has this sense that sexuality should be something that is playful, that is fluid, that it should not be bound by rigid categories and dogmas. And the fact that like now it has become so rigid and dogmatic, I think he would be disappointed. But also the fact that like that so many academic papers and essays quote him as if he is like as if
Mm,
it's the Bible. It's like you see these young academics who feel like this duty, like I have to quote Foucault, I have to quote Butler.
yeah.
Why are they infallible sources of truth? I mean, if Foucault definitely wouldn't have thought so. So I don't know. I mean, how do you think we ended up in this place where like it's no longer about again the fluidity of the playfulness, but now it's doctrinaire and very fixed.
It's very interesting to me, and I probably don't know enough about the history, but um I do think that the very fact that Foucault draws attention to this. I mean, I think that Foucault's answer, it seems to me, at least in History of Sexuality, and I don't know if this volume one, I don't know if this is his mature answer, is something very akin to what you're talking about, this bodies and pleasures, that seems like a very fluid kind of notion, one that I don't know that it's attractive in the end. I mean, in some ways it's attractive, but it's one that seems utterly destabilizing. I do think that maybe it's the case that program, the program of, well, sorry, it's not a program, but this idea that maybe one day there will be a way in which we can think of ourselves in not in terms of sexualities, but in terms of bodies and pleasures. Maybe it just seems like politically unrealizable. And so it may well be the case that, and I think it probably was the case that queer activists and gay activists took to the notion of identity as a way of sort of mobilizing a political cause for what they took to be justice. And I think that's understandable, but there is a great irony there, I think, the since Foucault himself wouldn't, it seems, have endorsed this kind of identitarianism. I mean, I think that it's just that it's a little bit, I guess the idea is that it's hard to see where one goes from there politically or something like that. But I do think that sometimes it seems as though, what Nietzsche did to Christianity or something like that, talked about like the demise of Christianity and what comes after. Foucault does for something like liberalism or progressivism or something like that. Talks about what ought to come after, but it can be a difficult vision, I think, to realize in practical terms, I'd imagine. Which
Yeah.
is to say, maybe it's not a political program. Maybe it's not a political program. Maybe that's not the way that it ought to be, that Foucault would have had it implemented. Oh, here's what I was going to say. I do think that there's an irony in that Foucault is so widely used in the social sciences when in fact
Yeah.
he was so very skeptical of the role of the social sciences in giving us our and producing our self understandings and self conceptions. So your point about him being cited as scripture in the very many of the very disciplines he was skeptical of is really something that's, there's another irony.
But also the fact that, I mean, Foucault can't be canceled for his
Huh.
quote unquote problematic behavior. Like he's given a pass in every case, even though like his crazy behavior is, I mean, we could say is a feature and not a bug of his ideas. Like,
Yeah,
whereas people who, you have people who are canceled for, doing messed up things, but has nothing to do with their scholarly work. Whereas Foucault, absolutely, but again, he's infallible. You can't cancel him, even though his ideas might lead to some dangerous things. Um, but I mean, but then
very
the other
interesting.
thing, yeah, the other thing you bring up though in the article is, yeah, his skepticism about power and how, like, I mean, I see it everywhere today. Like we talk about how, we have to liberate ourselves from oppression, from, we need to be free sexually, and that means we need to talk more and spread visibility and whatever. Um, but what ends up happening is that power creates this narrative of liberation, which like doesn't actually give us more agency, but actually instead inhibits our agency, our freedom, and dictates to us like this is what liberate. This is how what yeah, this is what liberation is supposed to be like. This is how you're supposed to behave. This is how you're supposed to identify yourself. And like I think his critique of power kind of saw this coming if you pay close attention to it. No. So I'm wondering, like, how do you see that prophetic concern about power, like happening today?
I think you're absolutely right, and that it is maybe the most striking thing for me initially, at least, about the book was the way that he talked about the repressive hypothesis and the way that that repressive hypothesis, this idea that the way in which power operates on sexuality is as a repressive force, gets things exactly backwards. When he talked about this sort of speaker's benefit and why we're attracted to the repressive hypothesis, this idea that we're attracted to thinking that sexuality and our talk about sex especially is repressed because it feels so good to be able to speak against power. And so the idea is that we're told by, by the powers that be that we are repressed and that we ought to speak out against power. And so we do, and it feels really good, would be the idea. But in fact, we're further enmeshing ourselves in those systems of power. And I think that one can see how this would go just by, I mean, in my silly example, thinking about, the close talker. There are many different social categories that we could use, and there are going to be many different truths to be found about people in those social categories. So it's undoubtedly true that some people get more get closer to people than the culture dictates that they ought, when they speak to them. Um, but the reason it's funny to call that person a close talker is because we don't think that's a kind of person. We think that's simply what people sometimes do. And if we did decide that that was a type, I'm sure that there would be other truths that we could find about what close talkers are like. But
Yeah.
um,
Mhm.
in promoting that, we would find out more about, those who were close talkers would may well sort of try, even subconsciously or unconsciously, sort of bring themselves into line with the norms of what we're told about. And so that seems not to be a recipe for liberation as much as it is, a certain kind of constriction.
Yeah, and I mean the thing that is most on my radar now is how like certain narratives, certain terms are kind of constructed by entities in power for the sake of, again, for the sake of limiting our agency. So like they
Mm,
co-opt the language of liberation, of resistance politics, but
yeah.
ultimately render it hollow and null, so that like you're not actually becoming more
Yep.
liberated, you're actually becoming more enslaved. And like one silly example that brought this to mind, like there's a campus nearby where apparently there was like a Jewish student organization that wanted to invite a Jewish drag queen to do a drag show. And
Okay.
I mean, I don't know that drag was like an essential part of Jewish liturgy or
Huh.
spirituality. I'm sure there's a case for it. But no, so they wanted to have
Sure.
a drag show, and then
Yep.
this like trad Catholic group did a rosary rally and a Marian procession, and then had like American flags that said like "Take back our country," and then started like
Mm.
posting slurs on whatever
Oh
the
dear.
social media platform was. And now they're like, "Oh, hate crime." And I'm just like, this is so like it's all so mimetic. Like you see these tropes, these memes on the internet, and you
You
just
said it.
imitate them. But then it's like, but what are we fighting about in the first place? Because you want a Jewish drag show? But then the irony of this is that there's some larger organization that has been pushing certain student campus groups at various universities to do this kind of to like provoke and like get a conservative reaction so then they can, publicize. So it's like again, a lot of these narratives about sexual liberation, but also like even for the trad conservative Catholics who are like, we have to take back the country for these, demonic
Yeah,
whatever, cultural Marxists. Like it's all super manufactured and is really hollow. And again, makes it kind
absolutely.
of more controlled than, in touch with whatever cause we claim to be advocating for. And again, like I think Foucault foresaw that like this logic of resistance, of we have to react against the power, we have to fight back, is really futile because just like this direct reaction against the powers that be, it's not going to do anything. Like, and I think this is where, like, if you look within Christian spirituality, like if you look at, I don't know, like the monastics of the early church, like they would always say, like, you never confront the devil directly. Like you always have to outsmart the devil. You always have to work your way around the devil in order to defeat him. Because like if you go from directly, he's gonna know what you're doing. So I don't know, there's something about like the logic, it's like there has to be something that transcends the logic of power in order to subvert it. You can't fight power with power. So like even like this is where you see there's like perhaps some overlap between Foucault and like a more traditional Christian view that like power does bend towards corruption. We'll say because of original sin. He'll say for other reasons, but you see where like I'm kind of getting at with that.
I absolutely do, and I think that Foucault does see that power. I mean, in a certain way, I think that the problem with well, sorry, let me just first say, I think it's a brilliant comparison with the monastics and this idea that fighting power with power is ultimately futile and certainly isn't a way to successfully defeat demonic power. Um, I think of the notion of silence in the face of some of these things, of sort of silent prayer and not sort of acting out. It seems to me that what the conservative activists did at the drag show was certainly counterproductive, and especially if it's carried out with slurs and all the rest is going to be counterproductive and even itself demonic because it is mimetic in that way. It's this kind of I think that's a really good way to see it. And let's see, there was another point that you had made about the similarity.
With the Christian kind of response.
Yeah, that this oh, I think that you're right that the Christian recognizes that power corrupts. And I think that there's a sense in which Foucault does, although it's not clear to me that there's a clear way that Foucault can denote what is corruption after all. I mean, that he doesn't
Yeah.
have enough, he doesn't have sort of a normative, he doesn't claim to, I mean, to his, I guess, to his credit. I mean, he doesn't he doesn't claim to have a theory or a take on that. He claims to just be providing tools. But as as Sohrab Ahmari's piece in Compact sort of argues, without some sort of normative basis, it gets difficult to discern corruption from proper uses of power.
Yeah, I mean, but this is why I think Christians ought to be interested in postmodern theory because there is this potential overlap. There's also potential to like, unravel everything that Christianity has established and stands for. But I don't know. But on the other hand, it's like the fact that universities have kind of created a, deific figure out of people like Foucault. I understand the reactionaries. I understand the people who are like, yes, this is demonic and we have to get it out because there's such a hegemony. But
Yeah,
I think now that like people are starting to see through the like standard woke narrative. Like I think now we're a little more free to like stop reacting. Like, okay, but like what's interesting here? Like what can be said? Um,
I completely agree. I love teaching Foucault and I love teaching Nietzsche. And I mean, and not just because I think that they're intellectually interesting, and I certainly don't proselytize for my faith or anything like that. I think it's like professional malpractice to try and almost even to say what you believe in the classroom.
yeah.
I mean, of course it's going to influence things, but I'm not doing that. But Foucault and Nietzsche give you an opportunity to think through things that really are important to people of faith, and in a way that comes at it from a perspective to which people are more inclined to be open in the university, I think. So I think you're exactly right about that.
Yeah, so I mean, now that you said it, like let's talk a little bit more about Nietzsche and how I mean, I think both you and I have a
Mm.
similar understanding of how Nietzsche can open the door to rediscovering certain truths, to rediscovering faith, even though he declared I mean, he didn't even declare God as dead. It was more of an observation than a declaration. But I don't know. I mean, for like, where does that overlap happen for you? Like, what is it that interests you most about Nietzsche?
Well, I thought that I will say to begin that I thought your piece on Benedict the 16th and Holy Saturday and his reflect, I thought that was just
Yeah.
an excellent piece. That was really it was in many ways moving to read it now as we're heading into as we're in Holy Week. Um, I thought that was really great, and I do think that that Nietzsche, when he has the madman declare that God is dead, I guess he says it at some point earlier than that in the book, but in the madman's declaration, the madman comes to the marketplace and declares that among those who don't believe in God. And so he's not so much telling people who believe in God, you're wrong, God is dead. He's conveying something to those who claim that they don't believe in God. And of course, he's laughed at, and that's when the madman sort of jumps into their midst and pierces them with his eyes and tells them that that they've killed God, and that we're his murderers, and that we've unloosed the earth from its sun, he says, and things like that. So he wants them to understand the gravity of this happening, of this fact that God is dead. And I think that Nietzsche can be really salutary for Christians because he is an honest atheist. He's somebody who is very honest in his atheism and thinks, for instance, that Christian morality goes away when Christian metaphysics goes away, that it can't be sustained. At least it can't be justified. And I think one place that's very interesting in that regard is our the belief in the equality, the equal worth of all human beings, that each human being has has a has great worth, no matter how they might differ in merit. They have like an equal basic worth. And I think Nietzsche thinks that that is just the product of Christianity. It's historically a product of Christianity, and that its justification depends on something very much like Christianity. And so that Christian foundation, or without some kind of theistic foundation, Nietzsche at least seems to think that this kind of that kind of egalitarianism, this egalitarianism about equal worth, is unsustainable, and that's quite striking.
Yeah. No, because it is. I mean, all of
Yeah,
Rich's discourse, if it isn't rooted in not just a transcendent ideal, but like an experience of the transcendent, an encounter with Christ, like, no, it doesn't hold up at all. Like, there's no way
yeah,
to recognize the dignity of every person. And that's where I think like that's where I think like we Christians need to read Nietzsche to be provoked to really consider like how radical, how unnatural Christianity. I mean, supernatural, but
I
like
agree.
not natural at all.
I agree.
And even like the slave master morality, like Christian ethics are not should not be normative. Like they're not like this attempt to equate respectable bourgeois respectability with Christianity, like there's no way because this idea that I have to turn the other cheek, that if you rob my coat, I give you the other one, like this is ridiculous. Like it does not add
Yeah,
up at all. But there is a logic, but it's not a natural logic. Like you have to have an experience of the supernatural for it to make sense. And I
it's
think
not a
he
natural logic. I completely
no,
agree. Sorry,
absolutely
go ahead.
not.
This is
No,
great.
but also like chastity, poverty, like all these things don't make any sense unless you have an experience of God. And I think Nietzsche forces you to consider and not to just like be like, oh yes, Christianity, very nice. Like we're nice to people, we do what's right.
Yep,
But then, I mean, for me, what's interesting is like towards the end of his life, he starts to see that his philosophy doesn't hold up. Like he recognizes I quoted it in I think the Newsweek piece that, or maybe also in the Benedict one, that like he starts to say like I'm at a point where I want to submit completely to something almighty, to some all-powerful being, because life doesn't make sense. But also just this need to be loved and not to be alone. Like at a certain point you see this like self-sufficiency is impossible as well. You know. Did
yep.
you? Yeah, go ahead, guys. Say
No, please, please.
No, I was going to ask. I think I cited the play Nietzsche, My Brother, that the Carmelite sister wrote about Saint Therese having a dialogue with Nietzsche. Are you familiar with it at all? You ever seen?
I'm not actually, but I'd love to. I'd love to know
Yeah.
about that.
Well, they
Yeah.
stayed at a hotel at the same time in Paris once.
No, see, I didn't even know that. My
Nietzsche going
goodness.
back. So when she was going to ask the Pope permission to enter the Carmelite order, she stopped. She stayed at a hotel in Paris, and Nietzsche was there that night. So this nun heard that and was like, well, if they had met in the hotel, what would they say to each other? So she writes this dialogue. Basically, I mean, Nietzsche like kvetching about how everything is meaningless and, needs to be an Ubermensch. And then Therese is just like, kind of consoling him, like, yeah, I feel the emptiness as well. I know there's an abyss, but what if there's something there? Like, what if there's something in the abyss? But basically, showing the overlap between Christian apophatic theology, mysticism, and the Nietzschean sensibility. They're not that far apart. It's a very insightful little play.
I take your point. That sounds really interesting. I'll certainly have a look at this. I think that there on this on the particular on a certain reading of Nietzsche, which isn't the one that my co-author and I give really in our book, but in a certain reading of Nietzsche, I think that there is this kind of apophantic uh, sort of sense that one gets, and I'd never come across the letter that you quoted where he talks about wanting to submit to something, or wanting to believe. And I also think that the notion of love, it seems like, at its root, Christianity, I mean, it is about the highest goods are relational goods. They're goods, it's relationship to God and relationship to others. And it's not clear to me that certainly isn't clear to me that for Nietzsche the highest goods are, and it's not clear to me that he has a real place for those kinds of goods, because you're right about this need to be self-sufficient.
Mhm. I also wanted to ask you about Max Shaler's piece on ressentiment. Have you read it at all?
It's been a
Yeah.
long,
For me
long
too.
time.
I don't read it a lot. But I mean, it's another thing that I think every Christian should read because, like,
I
you,
should go back to it. It's a good
yeah,
reminder. Yeah, I should go back to it. It's been
yeah,
a very
because I
long
think
time.
that Nietzsche's right that a lot of Christians like live Christian morality out of a place of resentment, and I think,
Amen.
yeah, I mean, it's true. I mean, you see it all over. Something about
I had a professor in graduate school who said Nietzsche is excellent Lenten reading
well,
for
that's what I was
Christians.
gonna say. We should read that for Lent. Yeah, no, because again, like you can say that the claim that Christian morality is purely fruit of resentment. We could say that's false. It's the fruit of God coming to earth, but it's still possible to live it that way, and I think many of us do. So, like, definitely a good way to check our conscience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I do think that that I think is a way that Christians can use Nietzsche for a kind of really valuable self correction and growth in holiness. And I think that on the other hand, that Nietzsche can be used, almost I think in a way to show those who don't believe, who aren't theists even, that many of their beliefs, are ones that make sense only in light of Christianity and only in light of the shadow of this dead God, which I don't think at the end of the day they think. Sorry, I mean they do hold these values and they do hold the equality of human worth, even though according to Nietzsche it just doesn't make sense if they're going to be honest and consistent atheists.
Yeah. And I mean, just going back to the whole trad phenomenon, like,
Yeah,
I can't help but see a lot of resentment behind it. Like this, I mean, a lot
amen.
of people who feel alienated, who feel misunderstood, and who like gravitate towards these trad circles on the internet. And now they feel very
Yep,
empowered because, like, I know the true faith, and I'm going to stand up against Vatican II and the Pope. It's very, like, if you're insecure and feel outcast, like, it's very empowering to tell yourself that. But are you truly empowered though? And especially with just the nature of these circles, that it's like this like hyper masculinity, the traditional gender roles. It's like,
yep.
are you really a hyper masculine virile man if you're like on arguing on these chat rooms? It's not really very masculine.
I completely agree. I could not
That's
agree more.
really
It's a really good insight about I think a lot of that, certainly the performative trad stuff is it's born out of something like resentment, It really is. I completely agree. I hadn't thought of it that way, but that's absolutely right.
Yeah. Well, so
Yeah.
I kind of want to circle back, and I wanted to bring up some of the work you've done on like fostering civil discourse, having dialogues, because
Oh,
yeah, like that's what's most interesting to me about like your take on these things, that like you have firm beliefs, but you want to engage various different ideas. And I think most of us struggle. Like most of us prefer to stay in our silos where, people agree with us. So yeah, I mean, why do you do that kind of work? Like when and how do you go about trying to foster that kind of discourse, those kind of conversations with students, with people you work with, etc.
well, I think that it's interesting because if you're a Christian or a Catholic with anything like small O orthodox beliefs in academia, then you find yourself in a place where you're going to disagree with people. And many of the people who I love very much, and just am, yeah, I love people deeply and I just like them a whole lot, and I just disagree with them about most things. And so I find that it's kind of a necessity in a way, but it's also like a joy. And I think part of that, I would like to say that it's this kind of ethical impulse that I feel, but it's also just that I just really enjoy it. I really enjoy it. I really enjoy thinking about perspectives with which I don't identify. I mean, maybe there's something Foucauldian in that
Hmm.
one can sort of try on these different ways of thinking, but I think that I never sort of lose sight of my my roots and my faith. Um, that said, I think that there is something not just, I mean, there's something joyous about it. There's also something really valuable about it. And I think it's good for students and all of us really to, I mean, as you say in one of the pieces that I read, to talk with people that you don't agree with. I think that that's really important, um, both in terms of learning more about them, but also learning more about what you think, and also making these kinds of connections and maybe finding insights that you know certainly that you wouldn't have otherwise. I actually tell students, you know, when I ask them to write a paper, I tell them whatever position they take, I'm going to grade it from the perspective of someone who disagrees with them. And I tell them that's not just because I'm an ass. It's also because I think it's really important to be able to write and communicate in such a way that that you can reach people who don't already agree. That seems to me to be absolutely crucial.
It sounds like a lot of what's driving that openness you have is like a genuine curiosity. Like you're curious to know what other people think. There's an
Yeah.
interest there, but why, I don't know, like why is that the norm? Like why do you think we have such a hard time having that openness, being curious to like, okay, I don't agree with you, I think you're wrong, but this might be interesting. What's blocking that?
Well, I think that part of it can be, I mean, in one of the pieces you quoted, I think it was Pope Francis saying, you know, you ought not converse with the devil, maybe with harkening back to something that you'd said a little while ago.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that there's truth to that. And you know, when I think that sometimes people think, well, I ought not converse with the devil, or because I might myself be taken in. And you know, I get that if that's the reason. If the reason is that you might be taken in. I mean, when my advisor as an undergraduate sort of told me I shouldn't take a course in Nietzsche, you know, I get that. Like maybe I was sort of impressionable at that early stage, and maybe he did see something. And so, you know, I don't think it has to be for everybody at all times. But I think that there are, like, maybe that's an okay reason, but I think that we often sort of feel like we're going to be you know, polluted or something like that by thinking about these ideas. Not so much that we think we'll be deceived, but that we'll be polluted. And that seems that just seems false and certainly contrary to the work of Jesus, who ate with tax collectors and sinners and all the rest, and tried to understand and reach people. So I think that there can be good reasons and bad reasons for you know, maybe individuals have good reasons for not feeling up to engaging in dialogue across these like deep differences. But I think that in general, it's really important that we do so, and important that we do so as Christians.
Yeah, and I think in addition to it to being like personally beneficial, because again, like a lot of ideas are interesting, even if they might be erroneous. But also, I mean,
Absolutely.
but it's also socially, politically expedient if people are actually talking to each other. Because like if we're in our silos, and we just completely hate our enemies, then like we're not going to be able to accomplish very much with only the people we agree with. Whereas if we're all in the same space with our disagreements, but like able
Absolutely.
to interact, like we're able to accomplish a lot more, you know. And it goes back to the power thing. Like this is what I always come back to, like that Foucault had this insight that, like because power bends towards corruption, if there aren't, I mean, this is the church's social teaching. Or if there aren't smaller mediating bodies, and we're just atomized individuals, then we're completely vulnerable to the corruption of power. Whereas if we are working together, even with the people we disagree with, like then there's a buffer, like there's a way to actually subvert power. So that I don't know. This is why again, like I'm interested that like you're doing that kind of work, but also like this is your angle when you're covering people like Foucault and Nietzsche.
I think that that's just right. I mean, I think that that is why it's one of the reasons it's so necessary that we be with those with whom we disagree, because very often we find, I mean, I think it's one of the great things about your Substack, about Compact, about other places that are engaging in, that have a variety of voices from a variety of people, but still have a perspective in a certain important way. It's not as though, I think that some people think that either you're sort of doctrinaire in a way that is narrow, or you're just a complete relativist. And neither of those seem, that just seems like a false dilemma to me.
And they're boring
Um,
too.
Absolutely boring, terribly boring. I think that that's it too.
Yeah.
Like sometimes I feel like maybe as you say, it's curiosity or some aesthetic interest as well. And I'm just glad that it happens to coincide with what I think are ethical and religious claims, or
Yeah.
aims or something like that.
Well, von Balthasar would agree that, like, I mean, the
Yeah.
aesthetic opens to the ethical and the true. But anyway, okay. So before we go, obviously people should read your essay on Foucault. But anything else you would want to plug to our listeners
Oh gosh, I guess I did a conversation with Jeff Schulenberger over there on the Compact,
on blame
the
theory?
the
Yeah.
Blame series, which was a lot of fun. And but I'm hoping to do some more, sort of more public writing in the future. So um, yeah, and I'll look forward to getting to read your stuff as well, because I've learned a good deal from it and I appreciate it.
Well, David, thank you again for coming on. I enjoyed it very much.
Thanks, Stephen.